I was exhausted. Another long day, filled with tight deadlines and a boss who seemed to thrive on my fatigue. When the clock struck 6 in the evening, I already felt the weight of the routine crushing me. The only thing I wanted was to get home, collapse on the couch, and, for a brief moment, forget that the next day everything would repeat itself. The subway station was as usual, crowded, noisy, but strangely comforting. There was something in the controlled chaos of those hurried people that made me feel safe. I knew those faces, although I had never exchanged a word with most of them. The man in the gray suit and dark glasses, who read the folded newspaper meticulously, the woman in the red jacket, always with a lost look, as if she was reliving some dark past, the teenager with headphones, isolated in his own world. It was always the same faces, every day, without fail. Getting on the train was almost a relief. Even on those days when I could barely find space to lean on, the environment was still familiar. The vibration of the wheels on the tracks, the sound of the station announcements, even the peculiar smell of recycled air, all were part of my ritual of returning home. But there was something unsettling in that predictability, as if the very repetition was conspiring against me. As if each day was a piece in a larger puzzle, and I was about to discover that a vital piece was missing, or worse, that there was an extra piece, something I shouldn't have noticed. That night, something felt different. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, but I sensed a tension in the air, a sort of invisible discomfort that I couldn't quite define. The subway lights flickered occasionally, something I had never noticed before. And, although everyone was there, in their usual places, there was a strange silence, a kind of quietness that seemed to absorb all the sound around. When the subway arrived, the car was more crowded than usual. The doors opened with a sharp hiss, and I found myself pushed inside, trapped between bodies that moved mechanically, like gears in an old machine. I managed to find a spot to lean on, trying to balance myself as the train started moving. I looked around and, as always, the same faces. Each one immersed in their own bubble of thoughts. Somehow, that night, the familiarity was a relief. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, as if that endless cycle was about to break in a way I wasn't prepared to face. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. All I wanted was to get home, but a part of me, small and buried in some dark corner of my mind, began to fear that maybe tonight I wouldn't make it. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, forcing myself to ignore those irrational thoughts. After all, it was just another ordinary night, on an ordinary subway, surrounded by the same ordinary faces. Or so I thought. I was still fighting off the exhaustion when the subway jolted to a stop at the next station. To my surprise, an empty seat appeared in front of me, like a gift from the gods of public transport. Without hesitation, I threw myself onto the seat, feeling the immediate relief in my legs and back. I ran my fingers along the armrests, feeling the cold, rigid material beneath them. The environment around me seemed to pulse with a drowsy rhythm, as if everyone around me were in some kind of collective trance, lulled by the repetitive motion of the subway. I, for my part, let my head rest against the wall of the car, trying to disconnect from everything for a few minutes. The darkness behind my eyelids was welcoming, a temporary refuge from the world outside. Each time the train took a turn, I felt my body gently pushed to the side, a soft sway that, along with the distant rumble of the wheels on the tracks, dragged me even deeper into a state of relaxation. I knew I shouldn't, that it wasn't safe to fall asleep in a place like that, but the exhaustion was unbearable, and the familiarity of the environment offered me a false sense of security. As my body gave into sleep, for a brief moment, I thought I heard a whisper, something indistinct that passed too quickly to be caught by my already dazed mind. I ignored it, convinced it was just background noise mixed with my imagination. After all, nothing unusual happened there. It was just another ordinary ride, right? When I woke up, everything was different. I opened my eyes slowly, still enveloped in the fog of sleep, expecting to see the same usual scene, the crowded car, people absorbed in their own worlds, the constant murmur of conversation and headphones. But what I found was the opposite. The car was empty. Completely empty. I blinked a few times, trying to undo what seemed like a trick of my mind. I looked around, expecting to see familiar faces, but there was no one. The lights above me flickered intermittently, casting quick, unsettling shadows that danced on the walls. The silence was deafening, filling the space that had previously been crammed with everyday sounds. I sat up straight, now fully awake, my heart beating faster. My breath echoed in the quiet air, a sound that seemed amplified by the absence of any other noise. Where had everyone gone? How could I have slept so much that I didn't notice the car emptying out? I stood up slowly, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Every step I took seemed to echo in a surreal way, reverberating off the metallic walls of the car as if I were in a cave. The smell in the air was different too, denser, a mix of metal and something else, something I couldn't identify, but that left a bitter taste in my mouth. I looked out the window to see if I could identify where I was, but the landscape outside was a blur of darkness, no stations, no signs of life. Just darkness. What was happening? The subway never passed through such a long stretch without stopping. I sat down again, trying to rationalize the situation, but the truth was, I had no explanation. The sense of security that had once lulled me was quickly turning into dread, as if something invisible were watching me from some dark corner of the car. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, though there was no one there. My mind was at war. Part of me wanted to scream, to call for help, but another part, more primal, knew that silence was my only defense. Any sound I made could attract something. It was at that moment that I realized it wasn't the subway that was empty. It was me who had crossed an invisible line that separated me from the world I knew, and now I was in a place where the rules were different, where normality didn't apply. And in this new world, something was waiting for me. Something I didn't want to encounter. I sat on the seat, trying to keep calm. Just wait, I told myself, the next station will arrive soon. But as the minutes dragged on, that certainty began to fade. The subway continued on its path, but the next station never appeared. Instead, everything around me seemed increasingly out of place, more wrong. I looked out the window again, hoping to see some familiar landmark, but all I saw was opaque darkness, interspersed with occasional flashes of light that looked more like reflections of the car itself. There were no signs, no buildings, not even the intermittent lights of the tunnels I was used to seeing. It was as if the subway was passing through a place that shouldn't exist. The feeling of oppression grew. The air in the car seemed heavier, harder to breathe, as if something was squeezing my chest. My eyes roamed the environment, searching for any sign that this was just an illusion, but the only thing I noticed were subtle details that made me even more uneasy. The color of the walls seemed to be fading, the seats had dark stains I didn't remember seeing before, and a faint metallic odor filled the air, a subtle reminder of blood. I forced myself to look out the window again, hoping for an explanation, but all I got was an even more disturbing glimpse. There was something outside, something moving in the shadows, keeping pace with the subway. A figure, tall and slender, that seemed to walk alongside the train but without actually moving. Each time the subway passed one of the rare emergency lights in the tunnel, the figure seemed to get closer, revealing a silhouette that was not human. It wasn't a reflection, it couldn't be. I pulled away from the window, my heart racing. It can't be real, I whispered to myself, but the words sounded hollow, devoid of any comfort. Every fiber of my being screamed that something was terribly wrong, that I was in a place where the laws of the world I knew no longer applied. Time seemed to drag in a strange way. Minutes stretched into hours as the subway continued its relentless journey. My mind began to play tricks, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. I thought I heard whispers coming from the speaker, but they were nonsensical words, as if someone was trying to tell me something that wasn't meant to be understood. I began to move through the car, trying to do something, anything, to stave off the growing terror. But no matter where I looked, everything seemed distorted, subtly and terrifyingly warped. The windows that had once shown the outside now reflected images that shouldn't be there. Twisted, pale faces without eyes, as if they were grotesque masks. But every time I blinked, they vanished, leaving only the darkness of the tunnel. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. My eyes automatically turned to the back of the car, where the door leading to the next car was slightly ajar. A thin, dark, silent slit, as if it were inviting me to cross it. There was something beyond that door, something waiting for me. But at the same time, the door seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if crossing it was a point of no return. Each time I looked away, I felt the slit widen, the darkness intensify, as if the darkness itself was swallowing me. I was trapped, not just in an endless subway, but in a reality that seemed to fold in on itself, dragging me into an abyss from which I didn't know if I could escape. And as the train continued forward, with no visible destination, the deep, visceral fear that I might never see another station continued to grow inside me. Then, with my heart racing and my breath heavy, I realized a terrifying truth. It wasn't just the subway that wouldn't stop. It was me who had lost control over the reality around me. And as the world outside continued to warp into impossible shapes, I knew that something terrible awaited me ahead. Something I couldn't avoid. My mind was on the brink of collapse, trapped between terror and a desperate need for answers. I could no longer stay still, waiting for the subway to magically stop at a station that never arrived. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to find someone, anyone, who could explain this nightmare I was trapped in. With a deep sigh, I stood up from the seat and approached the door separating the cars. The gap in the door, once small and innocuous, now seemed like a portal to something much darker. My instinct screamed for me not to open that door, to stay where I was, but logic or perhaps desperation prevailed. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and took a step forward. The air in the next car was different, denser, as if it was filled with something invisible but palpable. The lights here flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows on the walls and seats. It was then that I realized the car was dirty, far dirtier than the one I had just left. There were dark marks on the floor, like scratches, and something that looked like dried blood accumulated in the corners. The sound of a distant whisper made my skin crawl. I looked around, trying to locate its source, but there was no one there. Or at least, there shouldn't have been. The whisper continued, but now it seemed to come from all directions, as if the car itself was whispering, a low, melodic sound that seemed to try to lure me, seduce me to go further. The door to the next car was ahead, slightly ajar, like the previous one. But this time, I didn't need to push it open on its own, as if inviting me to continue. And, against all instincts of self-preservation, I did. With each car I passed through, things became more distorted, more disturbing. The third car was almost completely dark, except for a single flickering bulb on the ceiling, casting a weak, yellow light over the seats. It was here that I saw the first figures. They were not real people, or, if they were no longer alive. Dark silhouettes crawled along the edges of my vision, sliding between the seats and disappearing as soon as I tried to focus on them. Some were just fade shadows, but others seemed more solid, as if something was trying to take shape in the physical world but couldn't quite manage it. I could hear their movements, the faint scraping sound, as if their limbs were dragging on the metal floor of the car. My heart was pounding so hard I felt each beat echo in my ears, a constant thud blending with the whispers. My steps were slow, heavy, as if the floor was trying to pull me down. When I finally crossed the car, I looked back, expecting to see those figures again, but there was nothing but darkness. But I knew they were there, in the shadows, watching me, following me in a way I couldn't explain. The fourth car was even worse. The smell here was unbearable, a mix of decay and dampness, as if something was rotting inside the train itself. The walls were covered in marks, symbols I didn't recognize, drawn with something resembling old blood. The seats were torn, with foam and wires exposed, and the floor was soaked with a dark, sticky substance that made my shoes stick with each step. It was in this car that I first heard the sound of laughter, not joyful laughter, but something more sinister, distorted, as if it were a parody of human laughter. It echoed from all sides, a cacophony that seemed to grow in intensity with each passing second. I looked around frantically, but there was no one visible. Yet, I could feel a presence. Something was close, very close, and the laughter seemed to come from inside my head. I started to run, logic completely abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. I stumbled and almost fell, but I kept going, crossing into the fifth car with a sense of utter desperation. When the door of the fifth car closed behind me, the laughter abruptly stopped, leaving me gasping and covered in cold sweat. I was no longer alone, that was undeniable. Something was with me in the subway, something I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. Something that wanted me to keep going, to find out what was at the end of the line. And as I looked around the fifth car, I realized I was exactly where they wanted me to be. In that place, where the walls seemed to pulse and the air was thick with the scent of death, I knew I had crossed the point of no return. But the door ahead was open, like the others, and something inside me, an irrational impulse, told me I needed to continue. That the answer to all this horror was just beyond that door. Even if the answer was something I didn't want, or couldn't, comprehend. Suddenly, without warning, the subway stopped. It was so abrupt that I nearly fell, gripping the metal bar to avoid the impact. The silence that followed was deafening, as if even the train itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I looked out the window, my eyes burning with the effort to see through the opaque darkness that now seemed to surround me on all sides. And then I saw it. There, in the midst of the darkness, was the station. My station. It was the same, yet completely different. The lights were out or flickering weakly, and the platform was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had been there for years. My hands trembled as I pushed the door of the car. The sound of the metal creaking echoed through the empty tunnel, and I took a hesitant step out of the train. The air was dense, heavy with humidity and the smell of something rotten. My shoes kicked up small clouds of dust as I walked across the platform, each step sounding like a drumbeat in my head. I looked around, searching for any sign of life, but the station was deserted. The benches were corroded with rust, and the walls were covered in old graffiti and cracks that seemed to have formed long ago. It was as if I had been transported to a place where time no longer existed, a forsaken space between worlds. I passed a series of faded posters, some still hanging on the walls, but all were unrecognizable, the images and text blurred and worn by time. The sensation of being out of reality, of being in a place that should not exist, overwhelmed me. Everything around me screamed that something terrible had happened there, something I was not meant to discover. As I moved down the platform, I felt the presence of something behind me, watching every movement I made. It was the same feeling that had pursued me inside the train, but now it was stronger, more oppressive. I looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the endless darkness that seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. Eventually, I reached the stairs leading to the exit of the station. Or at least, where I hoped the exit would be. Every step I took was a struggle against the growing fear that urged me to turn back, to not go on. But I had no choice. Something inside me, perhaps the last vestige of sanity I still had, forced me to continue, as if leaving that place was the only chance I had to survive. But when I reached the top of the stairs, my heart sank. The station's entrance was blocked, covered by old, rotting wooden planks, with rusty nails sticking out like sharp teeth. There was no way out. I was trapped. Panic began to take over, and my hands moved frantically, trying to find a gap, a way to break free. But the planks did not give way, and then I heard it again. The whispers. They were all around me, growing in intensity, like a storm about to engulf everything in its path. I recoiled, my heart racing, and then I realized, even if I escaped the station, even if I managed to find my way back to the surface, I could never escape what I had experienced. The subway, with its cars full of shadows and whispers, had rooted itself in me, become a part of me. What I had seen, what had haunted me, would never let me rest. I returned to the platform, my footsteps echoing in the dead silence. The train was still there, standing as if waiting for me. The lights inside the car flickered weakly, and for a moment, I thought about getting back in, trying to find answers to what was happening. But I knew there were no answers, not really. The subway was not a place that made sense. It was a nightmare, a trap built from my own fear. I sat there, on the rusty bench, trying to keep control of my sanity while the weight of terror pressed on my mind. The feeling of being trapped in that nightmare seemed inescapable. With my head in my hands, I closed my eyes and wished with all my might that it would end, that everything would return to normal. The shadows, the whispers, the figures. Everything seemed to surround me, pulling me further into the abyss of despair. Surrounded by my own madness, I abruptly lifted my head, my eyes still filled with fear, expecting to see the same desolate scene as before. But what I saw left me completely bewildered. The station, which had previously been engulfed in darkness and deserted, was now brightly lit and full of people. The ceiling light shone brightly, and the air, which had been dense and humid, was now fresh and clean. People moved briskly back and forth, some laughing, others talking, as if nothing strange had happened. The familiar faces I saw every day were there, perfectly normal. I stood up, my legs trembling and unsteady, unable to understand what was happening. I looked around, trying to find any sign that this was still part of the nightmare, but everything seemed to be in its proper place. The benches were intact, without rust or dust. The posters on the walls were new, with vibrant colors and clear messages. My eyes searched for the train I had exited, but it too was different. Now, it looked like just an ordinary train, with passengers boarding and alighting as on any other day. There were no more shadows, no whispers, no sinister presence following me. Everything was exactly as it should be. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and adrenaline coursed through my veins, but there was no apparent danger anymore. I tried to reason, to find a logical explanation for what I had experienced, but my mind was a complete mess. Was it possible that it had all been just a dream? A delusion caused by extreme exhaustion? But the sense of reality had been so vivid, so terrifying. I couldn't stay there, trying to decipher what had happened. Something inside me screamed to get out as quickly as possible, before the nightmare returned, before the shadows and whispers took over again. I grabbed my things and began to walk, hastening my steps until I was practically running. I passed people who looked at me strangely, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. Finally, the stairs leading to the exit were in front of me, the same stairs that had previously been blocked by planks and rusty nails. Now, everything was clear, open, inviting. I climbed the steps two at a time, my shoes pounding against the concrete with force. When I reached the top and passed through the glass doors, the night air enveloped me like a wave of relief. Outside, the city was alive, normal. Cars passed by, people walked the streets, lights shone in the windows of the buildings. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but the sense that something terrible could happen at any moment still haunted me. I looked back at the station entrance, hoping to see some sign of what I had experienced. But everything was as it should be. No shadows, no hint that anything supernatural had occurred. Just everyday life, continuing as always. I walked briskly, my heart still racing, with the persistent feeling that, somehow, the terror still followed me. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I still don't understand what happened that night, whether it was real or just a product of my exhausted mind. But one thing is certain, I will never enter that subway again, and I will never view the world the same way. Even though everything seems normal now, the fear of what I lived through will follow me forever, like a shadow that never goes away, waiting to emerge again when I am most vulnerable.